I served a religious mission abroad in Venezuela. This particular experience happened when I was about 20 years old. While I wouldn't consider myself then or now an overtly religious or spiritual person, our ghostly visitor that spanned over the course of 3 nights continues to leave me shook. This all went down in the coastal town of Carúpano, Venezuela. 4 of us, all male and of the same approximate age, lived in the same apartment, which happened to be directly above a bakery. I don't remember exactly where it was, as this was so long ago, and I only stayed there for about 2 weeks. The apartment had a small dining receiving area, which was all open to the kitchen area when walking in, and then a single hallway to the right. On the first left was the only bathroom. The second door on the left was a bedroom with 2 single twin mattresses and 1 tiny small window at the top of the room between them. There was no working fan or AC unit, and it was very hot at night. So the 4 of us all slept in the largest room, which was directly across the hall from this one. There were 2 actual beds, one right next to the door and the other lining the adjacent wall. Then myself and another missionary simply laid our mattresses on the tan large format tile floor. As a Mormon, we would always go out in pairs. One morning, when myself and my assigned companion were out walking the street, he sheepishly asked me if he could share something with me. I told him sure, of course, but he shied a bit away from it. After a bit of encouragement on my part, he shared that when he had awoken during the night, he looked over and saw that there was a spirit that looked like a man sleeping next to me. Interestingly, I told him that during the night I had a dream that a man who was wearing what appeared to be an Asian conical hat and carrying a backpack had tapped on the bars of our apartment door. Weary from his travels, he asked if he could rest and stay with us for a while. I obliged and let him in. The other missionary asked me if we should share any of this with the other 2. Dismissing this as a weird coincidence, and not really caring to believe that any of this had any merit of being anything real, I simply waved it off and told him not to worry about it and that it was not worth sharing. It's important to know that as missionaries, we are rarely separated, and I know that for the remainder of the day and evening, he had absolutely no contact with the others. After getting to retire for the evening, I had gone to the shared bedroom, laid my mattress down, and was preparing to drift off to sleep. 3 of us had already retired to bed. The 4th, unaware of our previous conversation, was out in the bathroom brushing his teeth. As I lay there, I began to hear voices, the number of which and their loudness quickly began to increase, until it sounded like I was standing in the middle of a large and very loud crowd. I started to roll back and forth, believing that I might be losing my sanity. I couldn't take it anymore and was ready to scream out and ask for help. It was at this moment that the missionary who was out brushing his teeth burst through the door quickly, slamming it shut behind him. Eyes wide with fright, he hurriedly said in his native Spanish, "There's something out there. Something is in our apartment." None of the group dared leave the bedroom. We shared our story from earlier with the other 2 missionaries. One of them said a prayer. The rest of the night passed without incident. On the morning after the 3rd night, the 4th missionary, who had not experienced anything personally, shared with us that during the night he saw him leave the apartment. He and myself are Americans, the other 2 are Venezuelans. We pressed him for more details. He said that he saw him stand up from where I was sleeping on the floor. He watched him reach for the doorknob and open the door. He quietly walked out, shutting the door behind him. His bed was right next to where the door opened. None of us had left the bedroom that night. I don't believe he was mistaken what he saw. I then shared that during that same night, I had another dream, that our visitor had been standing above me where I was sleeping. While fussing with his conical hat, he thanked me for allowing him to stay and rest, that he needed to continue moving on. I also watched him leave the room in the manner described by the other missionary. I haven't actively attended church in over 5 years. I don't normally concern myself with ghosts or many spiritual things, but this experience continues to leave me pondering. My dad, being Irish and wanting to live somewhere close to his childhood home, bought a house in a remote part of Northern Ireland in 2007. It's a pretty old farmhouse, possibly from the 18th century, and at the time it was completely dilapidated. I'll never forget the first time he showed it to my brother and I. He had spent a long car journey hyping it up, telling us about how incredible the location was, how spacious it was, and the amazing interior. Then we arrived at what was essentially a creepy old building site. Still, over the years post-renovation, I've grown to love spending time there. There's beautiful green rolling hills surrounding the property. There's a sea view, and the beach is a stone's throw away, with nobody around for miles. It's a hermit's paradise. I have always, however, felt unnerved and creeped out by it. During the first holiday I ever spent there, I was around 9 years old. We were clearing out the attic and found an old photograph of a young woman, probably from around the Victorian times. My younger brother was absolutely terrified of it. I used to prank him by putting it in his bed before he went to sleep, or by rapping my knuckles against the bed frame, pretending that Bertha, as we nicknamed her, the ghost lady, was coming for him. It was granted an unnerving photograph. There was a wild, vacant look in her eyes, and she was ghostly pale in complexion. A local from the neighboring glen who knew about the history of the house mentioned that there was a rumor that a young woman had been murdered by her jealous husband in the late 1850s in a house in the lower glen. So it could have been our house, but also could have been of one of the other old houses in the area. That rumor, though, was enough to eventually make us return the picture to the attic, never to be retrieved again, even for pranks. At night, the house went from being creepy to being deeply unsettling. Bangs, footsteps, tappings, knocks sounded at all hours. My dad blamed the plumbing, the old pipes, and our imaginations. And that was what we would tell ourselves too, except that it would happen while the pipes were cold and when there was nobody else around. I remember one morning my dad and I drove to our nearest village to pick up coffee and the newspaper. Half an hour later we were back, to the immense relief of my brother, who was visibly shaking as he let us in. Apparently the second he was alone and watching TV, he heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps walking on the floor above him. Every time he paused the TV, it stopped, and when he resumed it, the sound would resume. He vowed never to be left alone again, and basically stopped coming to the house after that. In more recent years, I've been spending a lot more time at the house, being a lover of solitude and nature. I can't go alone, so I go with my partner, who finds it equally spooky. We both hear the unexplained sounds, the tapping and knocking at the windows, the footsteps at night. My partner is somewhat sensitive and has had paranormal encounters before. She said that the minute she stepped into the house, she could feel a sinister, dark energy emanating from inside. I got into the habit while we were staying there of going out on long walks in an attempt to prevent cabin fever. Whenever I returned, she would always report something eerie that had occurred while I was out. For example, once she had been vacuuming the living room and had felt two hands grab her by the waist, only to spin around and find nothing there. She felt taps on her shoulder, heard my voice calling out her name when I wasn't at home, and heard the sounds of people moving around the house while she was in the shower. Then recently, things got even scarier. We decided to go visit the house on a Halloween mini break, and the second we arrived, we both felt a very hostile energy, as if we were trespassing in somebody else's house. It's worth noting that shortly after my dad bought the house all those years ago, he ended up having to work full-time in London, so was unable to permanently live there. There was talk of renting it out, but nothing came of it, so the house just sits there, desolate, empty for most months of the year. But perhaps it does have a full-time resident after all. Anyway, we decided to try and shake off the feelings of unease and celebrate Halloween. We did the usual thing, got drunk, put scary makeup and costumes on, and watched stupid horror movies all evening. At around 11 p.m., my partner went to go and get another bottle of wine from the fridge while I stayed in the living room. I suddenly heard her say, "Oh my God," and I immediately stood up and rushed over to her. She turned to me looking frightened and said that she'd seen a white swirling mist outside in the garden against the pitch black darkness. It had vanished after a few seconds. That night, the noises and footsteps were louder than ever. A few days later, I was at the house by myself. My partner had gone away to see her family, who lived a few hours away, and would be returning later on that evening. I was sitting at the desk working downstairs in the living room, trying to ignore the growing uneasiness I was feeling. Then I started to hear, same as usual, footsteps sounding upstairs. But this time it was different. It was louder, as if a flurry of people were trampling around upstairs. I could hear the sound of bed sheets being moved, furniture being moved. It was coming from the upstairs room at the end of the house, where most of the unexplained noise originates from. The way I described it to those I related it to was that it sounded as if a few people were making preparations upstairs for a visitor, except I was all alone. I was petrified and immediately called my partner, telling her what was happening. It was so loud she could hear it through the FaceTime call. My most recent and what I consider most terrifying experience in the house so far happened less than a week ago, in the early hours of Monday morning. My partner and I had flown over for a weekend autumn break and had been due to fly home that morning. However, she suffers badly with endometriosis and had a flare-up, which meant we ended up delaying our flight. Anyway, it was about 5:30 a.m. and we were both in bed. She was asleep, exhausted from feeling unwell, but I was wide awake and listening to upbeat music, just praying for tiredness. Suddenly, without warning, I became overcome with this intense, consuming feeling of dread. I went from feeling good to feeling completely freaked out in the space of about 10 seconds. I took my headphones out and turned the music off. From my position, I could see the door in most of the room aside from the side of the bed. My partner was sleeping nearest the door and I was on the other side. The room was dark, but some morning light was starting to filter into the cracks between the blinds, with the shapes of the furniture in the room being visible. I could see the cracks of light underneath the door being reflected onto the wall opposite as we had left the lights on. And then I saw something, a shadow moving back and forth underneath the door. I started to feel even more afraid. Then I heard a very loud footstep just outside the door where the shadow was coming from, and the heavy creak of floorboards. I was at this point completely paralyzed with fear. Then, and I still can't believe this happened, I saw a dark gray figure glide from the door across the room. It was hooded, almost like a Grim Reaper, and I distinctly remember observing its transparency as it floated in front of the big wardrobe and around the bed to where I was lying. It was at this point that it went out of my line of vision. Being unable to physically move, I didn't turn to see where it went. I summoned up the courage to use my right hand to shake my partner awake. After a good few minutes, she woke up and turned the light on, becoming concerned when she saw the state I was in. Apparently, I was totally pale and shaking and unable to speak until she had managed to calm me down. I'm still recovering now. It was the most visceral, horrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. I think what made it so scary was the fact that I got a very sinister energy from whatever this thing was. We are now back at home, and I'm not sure if I'll be back to that house for a long time. I was 21 years old and just finished basic training for the Air Force, and I didn't have my tech school for another 6 months, so the Air Force sent me home to Hawaii. While home, my parents decided to take me to Vietnam to visit, as I'm Vietnamese, and my mom felt it was important for me to visit the motherland. On the trip, it was my parents, my 4-year-old brother, and my best friend Dan. For most of the trip, we did what normal tourists do. One of our destinations was to the city of Can Tho. It's a harbor city. Not thinking anything, and never really believing in the supernatural, I was also excited to visit historical sites and stay at old hotels. We ended up staying at a hotel that was by a harbor. I don't remember the name of the hotel, but me and Dan shared a hotel room, and my parents and little brother were in the next room. I remember going to bed like it was any other ordinary day. I was dreaming and saw this figure laying on the bottom edge of my bed, laid in the fetal position. For some reason, My eyes were focused on his feet, and I started to slowly move up to his body and realized he was naked. Then I saw his face, and at the moment I made eye contact with him, he stared right back at me. Once that happened, I began to have sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I could hear myself screaming, but nothing was coming out. I kept screaming, "Dan, Dan, Dan," but he could not hear me. So I told myself to calm down and try to burst out, and that's what I did. It worked. I jumped out and woke Dan up. The first thing he asked me was why my face was so pale and it looked like I had just seen a ghost. I told him what happened. It freaked him out and we ran to my mom's room and woke them up. My parents asked me what happened. As I was explaining to them what I experienced, the curtains covering their windows began to sway back and forth, and the lights in the room started flickering like crazy. My dad, who's a skeptic, yelled, "Leave my family alone," and then it just stopped. After several minutes of talking and trying to understand what happened, we went to bed. Dan and I slept in their room on the extra bed. The next day we woke up, my parents were already downstairs eating breakfast. When I went downstairs, my mom greeted me and told me she had someone for me to talk to. It was the hotel manager. She had told him what happened, and he told me it happens a lot to people that are in the military. I was confused and asked why. He said this hotel was built on top of what used to be an American hospital during the Vietnam War, and he said they're trying to reach out to their comrades. I became a believer in the supernatural ever since. Growing up in Hong Kong, I was often told by my dad that myself, my twin brother Nick, and older brother Keith are my grandmother's favorite grandchildren. It's because my father was the most successful out of all of his 7 other siblings. My brothers and I are the cutest, best-looking grandchildren, and most importantly, Nick and I are the only twins in the entire family, and to us Chinese, I'm guessing it's a symbol of luck. My grandmother passed away in 2008 when I was 10 years old. In 2010, when I was still a young schoolboy in Hong Kong, my house was under renovation, so Mom, Dad, Nick, my maid, and myself moved to my grandma's place, and we lived with my uncle who has autism, my grandmother's maid who still worked for our family. Nick, my maid, and I took my grandmother's room. The sleeping arrangement was very unusual. There were 2 beds linked together in an L shape which Nick and I took. My bed was next to a wall where a photo of my grandmother was taped on by her maid. My maid slept on a mattress on the floor. My uncle and grandmother's maid shared one room, and my mom and dad slept on the living room couch. Each room had no doors, just curtains for privacy. One night, Mom and Dad went across the border to mainland China to buy some furniture for our house. This meant that the living room was empty. During the night, I had 3 dreams. Chinese people believe that when you dream about a dead family member, it means they are trying to talk to you. In my first dream, I walked out to the living room where I heard a voice talking to me from the ceiling of the house, asking me how I had been. My mom told me to look up and reply because it was Grandma talking. I literally woke up right after, and I didn't put much thought into the dream, so I went right back to sleep. In the second dream, someone was knocking on our metal sliding gate. I went ahead to open the wooden door and unlock the sliding gate for an old lady that I didn't recognize. I kindly asked who she was, and my mom told me that it's Grandma. For your information, she didn't look like Grandma at all. I woke up again and also didn't put much thought into it. I went back to sleep again, and in the last dream, I walked out into the living room and Grandma asked me to sit on the couch with her where we had a talk and just caught up. I woke up again, and this time I couldn't go back to sleep at all. This is where the scary part happens. As I mentioned earlier, Mom and Dad were out of town, so the living room was empty. All of a sudden, around 15 to 20 minutes of being awake from the last dream, I heard the metal sliding gate outside rattling. It sounded like it was sliding only a tiny bit. I thought it was the wind. Then I heard the wooden door shake, and it sounded like someone was trying to use keys to open it. I then heard a click, which sounded like the lock. I was very freaked out at this point. I heard very light feathery footsteps walking in the living room. All of a sudden, sounds started coming out of the kitchen. There's a distinct sound of someone putting a metal dome cover onto a big Chinese wok and the sound of chopsticks being rearranged one by one in the chopsticks holder. I looked around my room where I saw Nick and my maid asleep. I then ran across the corridor into my uncle's room where I saw my uncle and grandmother's maid asleep. Basically, no one at home was awake at the time that I heard the noises. I ran back into my room, climbed into my sheets, and didn't dare to look at the photo of my grandmother. As I hid under the sheets, I felt a presence walking into the room from the living room. It was a weird feeling of warmth that came with a cool breeze. I instantly whispered in Cantonese, "Grandma, I'm terrified." All of a sudden that presence was gone, and shortly after, I was able to go back to sleep without any more dreams. The next day, when my parents came back, we all sat around the TV where I spoke about it. Instantly, Nick's face went pale. He told me that the 3 dreams I had, the sounds I heard, and the presence I felt were exactly what he experienced in the middle of the night also. He mentioned that his eyes were wide open and he did not dare face away from the wall. He was so scared that he was paralyzed by his own fear. Based on what I was taught from Chinese belief and my mom's superstition, we all agreed that Grandma was trying to communicate with her favorite grandchildren. To this day, I often ask myself, what if I walked into the kitchen when I heard the sound? Or what if I looked towards the entrance of the room when I felt that presence walking in? Would I have actually seen my grandmother's spirit? This happened a long time ago, when I was in my early 20s. A close friend had asked me to join her and her family for a vacation in Jamaica. I was young and broke and financially irresponsible, so I put it all on my credit card. I should preface this by saying that I was raised in an atheist household, and that I myself at that age was adamant that there were no such thing as souls, spirits, or ghosts, let alone God or gods or anything supernatural. The first 4 or 5 days were nothing but fun. My friend and I stayed in a hut on stilts overlooking the ocean. It was beautiful. Midway through our vacation, we had to change lodgings. We were still in the same resort, but they had rented out our hut to someone else for the rest of our vacation. We were supposed to move into an even better location called the Great House. Instead of our hut on stilts, we would be staying in a house with a kitchen and 3 bedrooms. It was set back from the ocean, but we could still hear it, see it, and smell the salty water. The first day that we showed up at the Great House, my friend and I began our inspection. As we walked in, we looked in a small bedroom at the front of the house. It was a very tiny room with 1 twin bed. Something about the room was dark and heavy, and not at all inviting. I commented on this to my friend, and she said she felt the same way about it. Then we proceeded to talk ourselves out of being creeped out of the room by noting that the bed was positioned in such a way that felt exposed, the artwork was kind of dark, and that the feng shui was all off. That night, I stayed in the largest bedroom in the house. It was beautifully appointed with a canopy bed and an ensuite bathroom with beautiful tile and ample windows letting in the ocean breeze and the wonderful sound of the waves. Yet when I went to sleep, I found myself terrified. I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching me. This time there was no bad feng shui to blame. The room just felt off. I was so scared that I turned on the lights in the room and slept with them on the entire night. In the morning, I told my friend how frightened I had been, but for no reason. She told me I was welcome to share her queen bed in her bedroom the next night. We went on with our day and didn't think about it again. Later that evening, we had a small gathering for my friend's sister's birthday. We were all sitting around a large table in the center of the house when I noticed someone walk in the front door into the room. I looked up to see who it was, but there was no one there. I probably would have just brushed it off, but my friend's father turned to me and said, "Someone just walked into the room." My friend, sitting on the other side of her father, turned to us and said, "Yes, I noticed it too." But again, as a non-believer in such things, I brushed it off as us all noticing a change in temperature, or perhaps a breeze, or something else that happened at the subconscious level, and I just went about my business. That night, I did stay in my friend's room with her. We giggled and chatted late into the night. When we turned out the lights, my friend went to sleep immediately, but I couldn't fall asleep. I wasn't frightened. I guess I just wasn't as tired as her. Shortly after I heard her quiet snores, I began to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I listened intently. It sounded as if they were coming from above me, as if there was a second story to the house, but there wasn't. In fact, there wasn't even an attic. The sounds intensified, and it seemed that someone was pacing back and forth above my head, from the bathroom area and back to the bedroom door over and over again. I looked for natural causes. Outside, the air was absolutely still. Looking at the trees, there was no telltale bending of limbs or shaking of leaves. Also, the window was open, and without a screen on it, the wind would have just come right into our room. So I rolled out the wind. There was no one else staying in the house, so it couldn't be that either. And it was the middle of the night in a resort that had a security entrance. I couldn't imagine someone had snuck into the resort only to climb to the top of the house and pace back and forth above our bedroom. It just didn't make sense. I lay there listening to the footsteps for what seemed like hours. The footsteps would fade in and out. Sometimes they would pause here or there. Sometimes they stopped at the bathroom, and I hoped that they wouldn't restart, but they did. At one point I shouted out in my head, "Go away!" And almost as a response, the footsteps suddenly got very loud and focused on the area above my head. My body tingled all over. I had the thought then that I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt in every inch of my body that this was a ghost. I still can't tell you how I would know such a thing, but I did. Just like you know the sound of a loved one's voice, I just knew. And I remember thinking to myself at that time, you're going to discount this later, but try to remember this is real. I know this is real. I know this is a ghost. Eventually, I fell into a troubled sleep. I dreamt that somehow I was floating above my body, drifting upward toward the ceiling, and around me was a blue glowing light. In the morning, I lay awake in bed, and my friend woke up next to me. She turned to me and said nonchalantly, "There was a spirit here last night. It was right there." And she pointed to the corner of the room above my head. My friend did believe in the paranormal, but it just didn't scare her. I remember wishing that it didn't scare me either. Later that day, I told her father what I had experienced in the house. He laughed and told me he had a conversation with the owners that morning. He'd asked them if there was a spirit in the house because of his experience of someone walking into the room the night before. They relayed to him that they thought it was the previous owner of the resort, who had been murdered in front of the great house a decade ago. The next 2 nights I stayed with my friend in her room, and nothing else happened. My friend and I have stayed in touch over the years. A few weeks ago, I visited her at her home 6 hours from where I live. We usually see each other at least once a year. I asked her if she remembered that experience in Jamaica so many years ago. She laughed and said she did. I asked her to retell the story to me without prompting her what she remembered, curious to see if my memory was off. To my surprise, her memory matched mine. I still remember that thought, that knowing that I wouldn't believe this later. This really is a ghost. This is the real thing. And I do find myself disbelieving sometimes. But part of me knows, can remember the certitude, can remember the sensations in my body, and I know for sure that I encountered an angry spirit that night. I lived in the house where this story takes place from the ages of 9 to 23 years old. My parents got divorced when I was 14. I lived with my parents, younger brother, and grandma. My younger brother was the first to notice something strange in the house. One night in 2005, he woke us up at about 11 p.m., crying, saying that there is someone outside his window. Living in South Africa, such things are possible, so my dad went to inspect and found nothing. A few weeks later, my aunt came to visit from out of town and was sleeping in my grandma's room. They relayed to us the next morning that she was awoken by the door opening and a figure staring at her from around the corner. Fast forward a few years to 2007, 2008. I would normally stay alone at home and my dad would go out fishing with my brother for the weekend. This is when I started noticing odd things. Keys would go missing, lights would be on after I know I had switched them off. Small things, but significant enough for me to notice. 2010 is when things got real. I was in my last year of high school and working part-time for my dad, who has an office in the same property as the house. I was working on a file. I left it on the desk, went to lunch, and when I returned, the file was gone. No one else could have taken it, as the only other staff member was the receptionist. About a week later, we found the file one morning laying on the floor. That weekend, a friend of mine stayed over in my brother's room when we came home from a party. It must have been 1 or 2 in the morning when we got to bed. I was already falling asleep when I heard him scream for me. I get to my friend, who was literally sweating, and I asked him what happened. He said someone was choking him as soon as he closed his eyes to sleep. From that day, I had been seeing the man, as we named him, around the property. I've seen him while working on my car in the garage. I've seen him while doing dishes. My father has even seen him while sitting in the garden. I never see his face, but he's always wearing a blue overall, like the ones construction workers wear. It wasn't serious until I got married and had a child. This takes us to October 2019. My son is 1.5 years old. He refuses to be in this house. He cries constantly when we visit my dad, and as soon as we leave, he is perfectly well behaved. 2 weekends ago, my dad had gone out fishing, and my brother was nowhere to be found, and I had to come feed the cats and switch on the lights. I came in at about 7 p.m. that Saturday night, and as soon as I walked into the house, I felt a chill. Thinking nothing about it, I carried on with what I had to do. While in the kitchen, I heard heavy footsteps in the lounge and a breaking of glass. I went to investigate and found a vase that is normally on the cabinet about 5 meters away, on the floor in pieces. I locked up and got out of there right away. I told my wife the story when I got home, and she suggested I burn incense around the house and read some prayers. Sunday morning, I set out on my mission and started burning incense and praying around the house. When I got to the office, I had just started praying when the glass sliding door shattered. Since then, my son hasn't been fussy when he comes here, and the atmosphere seems to be much lighter around the house.